Welcome, focused learners. If you're gearing up for an exam on Samuel Beckett's famously confusing masterpiece, Waiting for Godot, well, you are exactly where you need to be. Because today, this explainer is going to decode the whole thing for you. We're taking the brilliant, chaotic mess of Beckett's world and organizing it into clear, totally actionable insights you can use to absolutely crush your essays.
So, here's our roadmap for building your ultimate study guide today. 1. Welcome to the absurd. 2. Meet the waiting characters. 3. Theme, nihilism in waiting. 4. Theme, suffering and humor. And finally, 5. Your final exam takeaways.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1. Welcome to the absurd.
Before we get into the weeds, you really need to establish the historical context. These are absolute must-haves for your essay introductions. Waiting for Godot was written right after World War II, between 1948 and 1949, so it was born into a world of deep, post-war disillusionment. It's a tragicomedy in 2 acts, sitting right there on the bridge between modernism and postmodernism. But hey, if you only remember one thing from this intro, make it this. The play famously, and very deliberately, lacks a climax. Vladimir and Estragon wait for Godot, and spoiler alert, he never shows up. There is literally no grand resolution. And that lack of resolution brings us to your foundational vocabulary for this exam, the theater of the absurd. This is a genre totally defined by nonsensical lines, abrupt emotional shifts, and a really uncomfortable mix of tragic and comic elements. Look, if you try to read this like a traditional Shakespeare play, you're gonna be lost. It will make absolutely no sense. You have to analyze these characters' actions as reactions to a world that has been completely emptied of meaning. So now that we kind of understand the absurd, nihilistic world we're dealing with, let's take a look at who is actually trapped inside of it. Moving on to Section 2, meet the waiting characters.
The absolute best way to structure your character analysis is by looking at them as complementary pairings. Beckett specifically designed them to mirror and contrast with one another. Take our main duo, Vladimir and Estragon. Vladimir is the cerebral one, right? He's the guy holding on to the concept of time, trying to remember the past, constantly searching for a narrative. Estragon, on the other hand, is his physical, somewhat dull-minded counterpoint. He's rooted entirely in bodily suffering. He forgets who people are, forgets what day it is, and, famously spends the opening of the play struggling frivolously just to take off his own boot. Mental versus physical.
Then you've got our second pair, Pozzo and Lucky. Contrasting them with our main duo is a super crucial point to make because they perfectly illustrate a postmodern master and slave dynamic. Pozzo acts as the master, literally driving Lucky forward with a whip. But here's the catch. Pozzo's power is entirely relative and completely fragile. I mean, the guy has a full-blown panic attack when he loses his watch, and by Act 2, he's totally blind and helpless. Meanwhile, you have Lucky, the physically abused slave who's forced to carry heavy bags of sand for absolutely no reason. Yet, ironically, it's the enslaved Lucky who gets to deliver the play's only massive, deeply cerebral monologue. The takeaway? Everyone is entrapped, and nobody holds any true, stable authority. And finally, we have the titular Godot. Now, as you can probably guess, that name sounds an awful lot like God. Godot acts as this pessimistic, totally absent savior. He never actually shows up. Instead, he just sends this young boy to perpetually promise that, hey, he'll arrive tomorrow. Our characters are stuck waiting endlessly for a salvation that is just constantly, agonizingly delayed. Okay, with our pairings established, let's transition into the really heavy-hitting themes you're going to need to synthesize for your body paragraphs. Section 3. Theme, nihilism, and waiting. This theme is all about unpacking the central action, or actually scratch that, the central inaction of the play. Endless waiting, soul-crushing boredom, and this profound sense of nihilism. You absolutely want to memorize this quote from Estragon for your exam. Nothing happens, nobody comes, nobody goes. It's awful. It hits the nail on the head. But keep in mind as you write your analysis, Estragon is kind of wrong here. Stuff does happen. Pozzo and Lucky show up, hats get swapped around, they eat chicken bones. But those events are just so entirely pointless that the phrase nothing to be done genuinely becomes their ultimate reality. The act of waiting is the only real truth they have. And that builds right into this idea of postmodern entrapment. Time in Beckett's world isn't a straight line. It's completely recursive. It's a loop. Act 2 is basically just a blurry, slightly degraded repetition of Act 1. Characters forget what just happened, the exact same people show up, the exact same messenger delivers the exact same message. They're trapped in this infinite, meaningless present where all those grand narratives of progress have just vanished into thin air. The wildest part? No one is actively forcing them to stay.
but they just cannot leave. Next up, Section 4, Theme, Suffering and Humor. Now we need to tackle how Beckett actually pulls off this specific tragicomedy genre. He is an absolute master at mixing the horrific with the hilarious, and getting that across is vital for a high-scoring essay. He violently blurs the lines between tragedy and comedy to make the audience squirm. Think about it. The characters casually, almost pleasantly, discuss hanging themselves from a tree, right alongside slapstick gags like Estragon walking around with his fly unbuttoned. Lucky is being brutally abused right there on stage, and Pozzo is just whining about losing his pipe. It's intentionally designed to leave the audience completely disoriented. You honestly don't know whether you're supposed to laugh out loud or cringe in horror. Need to prove this absurdity in your writing? Just look at the props. Take the whole step-by-step hat exchange routine in Act 2. Lucky literally cannot think unless his hat is physically sitting on his head. And later, Vladimir and Estragon do this frantic, almost clownish juggling act, swapping their hats with Lucky's back and forth. It beautifully demonstrates that these characters don't even have stable core identities. They're just trying on different hats to play different roles, literally just to pass the time. And that whole nothing-to-be-done reality applies to the most basic everyday objects too. Even taking off a shoe is a major existential crisis. Estragon struggling with that stuck boot becomes this profound physical symbol of the sheer fruitlessness of human life. Even the names are a joke. Godot gives you this tantalizing hint of divine salvation, but ultimately functions as a massive, meaningless red herring. It promises everything and delivers absolutely zero. All right, Section 5, Final Exam Takeaways. We've covered a ton of ground, so let's bring it all home with a cohesive synthesis checklist you can take straight into your test. When you sit down to write, make sure you're connecting the macro to the micro. First, tie the broad nihilism of the theater of the absurd directly to the character's specific repetitive actions. Second, lean into contrasting your character pairs, like Vladimir's mental gymnastics versus Estragon's sheer physical pain. Third, make sure you explain how recursive time traps them in that eternal present. And finally, always mention the deeply unsettling tragicomic effect this all has on the audience watching it. So I'll leave you with this final provocative thought to maybe drop into your conclusion. Beckett traps both his characters and his audience in this endless wait for a salvation that simply never comes. As we sit there watching them bicker and suffer and desperately try to pass the time, are we just laughing at an absurd, nonsensical play? Or in our own search for meaning in a pretty chaotic world, are we actually just staring into a mirror? Definitely chew on that as you study. Good luck on your exams. You're going to do great, and keep learning.